All right, I think we've got everything squared away here. We are trying some new software and some other things going on here, so I'm looking forward to being able to make this a little bit more polished going forward. It's a new thing for me. I'm not used to live streaming or anything like that, and I used to teaching without people's faces in front of me. So bear with me with that. Again, as I've said before, I would like to add on, I appreciate your guys' patience with me from last week. My daughter was in the hospital last Wednesday, so I wasn't able to get to this lesson last week. So we're going to get into it tonight. Perhaps a really remarkable lesson in the responses of the Catholic Church to the Protestant Reformations. What I usually find is, with regards to a subject like this, especially coming from the Protestant world, we tend to play a little fast and loose with the definitions here. We tend to teach it almost exclusively from our own perspective as Protestants, and I mean that makes perfect sense as far as we are concerned. I mean, I can't teach from other than my own perspective, but we can do a little bit better, I think, than what we usually do when we talk about this, which is we kind of discuss it as merely a response to the Protestant Reformation, which is not true. There's much more depth to it than that. We also usually talk about it in terms that are a little bit more, shall we say, dismissive. And I don't want to do that. It's never served us any well to just simply dismiss an entire branch of a professing church. And so when we delved into this, and this is not me trying to minimize some of the massive cultural and doctrinal differences we have, but it really has much more to do with approaching these things from the perspective that we are looking to understand each other as much as possible. If, for instance, I have a Catholic friend who's wanting to talk or present on Protestant reformations or anything like this, I would hope that there would be some legitimacy to the claims that are made, and I would really hope for due diligence being put forward to how these things ought to be. And so, from my own perspective, when I teach on Catholicism, I'm not teaching as a Catholic. I teach from a Protestant perspective, and so that is going to have a certain slant to it. But like I said in the beginning here, I think we can do better than just simply referring to it as something different than us, or just reactionary to us. And so that kind of takes me to my first point. When we're talking about the 1500s, and especially for the Catholic Reformations, which you'll notice the title of this class is the Catholic Reformations and Responses. There's, again, plural. Always use plural with this. There's no singular one response. There's no singular one Reformation, even in the Catholic Church. There's a lot of different people. There's a lot of different forces. There's a lot of different countries. You have Spain. You have monastic orders. You have conciliar responses. Then you have apologetic responses. And so we're going to talk about a lot of this tonight. But I'm also aware that most of my audience are Protestants. And most Protestants, if they are familiar with how the Catholic Church was in the 1500s, if you've read a history book or a history book about this time written from a Protestant perspective, you'll usually see the references here regarding the Catholic responses to be the Counter-reformation. That's a term you will run into, the Counter-reformation, as though everything that happened in Catholicism in the late 1500s was merely a response to the Protestant reformers or even to the radical reformers. It was just a counter move. This is a term that is quickly falling out of date because, honestly, our awareness of everything that was going on is a bit higher than it used to be. And so you'll not really be seeing the term Counter-reformation going forward. It's really going to be much more of the what I titled here, the Catholic Reformations, because they truly are there, and we're going to look into them. It's not just a response to the Protestants. there was, just like in the Protestant circles or even in the radical reformers, there were differences of opinion that ran the whole spectrum. And so, when you have, like, for instance, we've used the term the magisterial reformers, people like Luther, people like Calvin, they're looking to fix the church. They weren't looking to separate it from it. They were hoping to be inside the church and help fix it. By the time we come to Calvin, that takes on a completely different mode. But their goal was not to destroy the church and start over from the ground up. That was not the initial goal. Not with Luther. Not even with someone like Zwingli. You have this idea that there was so much going wrong in the church that it needed reformation, especially for someone like Luther. It was in the area of salvation, justification by faith. There were abuses of the indulgences. The whole gambit was run on those things. But then you have, on this other side, you'll have the radical reformers, which we're going to talk about at length. I believe that's next week. We might get there. It depends on how tonight goes. The radical reformers will look at it and say, look, Catholic Church is too far gone. There's so many things wrong with it. Its concept of authority, its concept of tradition with a capital T, its misuse of scripture, and they'll go and they'll kind of run the gambit about so many different things that they would basically scorched earth would be their response. And so even in that, there's variances and there's a spectrum of responses. But what I really want everyone to appreciate tonight, and if you really get nothing else from tonight, at least get this overarching thing. Those who never did break with the Catholic Church, that are inside the Catholic Church, stay inside the Catholic Church, and continue inside of it, also have a spectrum of things to reform and deal with inside the church. You see, before 1517, everyone understood that the church needed reforming. Everyone understood that there was issues. There's always been issues. It's just for some, it was getting to a point where it needed to be dealt with and there was really no options outside of it. And so in the West especially, you don't have the collegiate rulership of the church like you have in the Eastern Orthodox Church, where you have the Bishop of Constantinople, Bishop of Antioch, Bishop of Jerusalem, Bishop of Alexandria. In the West, you just have the Bishop of Rome. You just have the Pope. And as we have seen in the past here, there was all sorts of papal issues. There was papal schisms. There was for a long period of time 2 completely different popes. And then at the tail end of that, 3 different popes, that a council had to come together, the Council of Constance, and solve that problem, because it seemed that the papal office wasn't able to fix itself or handle how to fix it or get itself out of that quandary. And so that leads to all sorts of ways to think about this, all sorts of ways to interact about this, but nobody could really deny that there was issues aplenty. There had been no real official statement on things like indulgences. There had been no real official statement, even on the things that the Protestant reformers were coming in and challenging. I mean, they're quoting people like Augustine, they're quoting people like Ambrose and Athanasius, and they're saying, look, this concept of salvation, this way in which the salvation of God has come to mankind, this has been taught since the very beginning, and here it is in the scriptures. And you also know, if you've been in this class for any amount of time, that the humanistic side of these things, the idea that we're going to leapfrog over the Latin translation, go back to the Hebrew from which it was written, go back to the Greek that the New Testament was written, and actually see these things for ourselves. And there we are trying to demonstrate that these things are taught there. So with all of this, everything that's going on, the Catholic Church as a whole, I don't ever want to talk about it as just a unified monolithic structure that everyone agrees inside. That's never been the case. It isn't the case today. There's all sorts of different sides inside, but I'm not a Catholic, never have been a Catholic, and I don't want to put forward that I am, or that I'm expert on that at all. What I can address are some of the aspects in which the Roman Catholic Church was attempting to already reform itself even before anyone named Luther was heard in anyone's ears. Okay? So I kind of want to start with this because I don't find that a lot of Protestants spend a lot of time with this, and I think that's unfortunate. At least this idea that everything was messed up, and then finally Luther came around and everything got fixed. Neither of those two things are true. Like all of history, it's much more complicated than that. And so we're going to get into this. I would continue to remind the chat is on the side. You are welcome to sign in, and if you have any questions as we go through, or even want any points of clarity, or you want to try to trip me up, that's something that some people try to do, and usually succeed, I would welcome it. So please take advantage of that. So let's go into this, right? The first point that I want us to come to is the Catholic Reformation of Spain. Now, if you're Protestant, or you've gone to Bible college, or you've even gone to seminary, you could be forgiven for never having ever run into this section before, because it's rarely ever taught about. The Catholic Reformation of Spain happened before Luther, right? For those of you who know the history of Christopher Columbus, for instance, you will recognize the name Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand. These two rulers, Isabella was the ruler of Castile, and Ferdinand was the king of Aragon. When they became married, they brought together a much more unified Spain than had ever been before. Now we're talking here late 1400s, right? This is before Luther was born. So there was need and call for reformation here. This one was a top-down reformation. The idea that even in the monastic world, inside Spain, monks were getting quite careless about their orders or their oaths. The bishops in certain sees, they wouldn't even live there, or they would hold multiple bishoprics. These types of issues we have addressed before. And for a lot of people, it had become such an issue that the way in which people would interact with it would really be almost desperate. How can you fix such a thing? Some of these parts are a little bit too far away from Rome to be garnering a huge perspective from Rome. But then in other parts, it's unless you really have a powerful force inside of a country in the late 1400s, you're really not going to get a massive desire, or not even just desire, a massive ability to actually push a reform. And so the desire for this, as we have discussed before, is going to have to come from the top down. That's the only way a Reformation is really going to take hold in the 1400s, before humanism really drives its way into the European mind. And so Queen is at the time of the Reformations, what she was desiring to do and what she had been exposed to and how she came about that is a really interesting story for another time. We're not going to spend much time with it here tonight, but I will just mention it in passing. Queen Isabella of Castile, her story, quite interesting one. She desired to reform the church in her lands, and unfortunately, though, much of this is going to be done with a fervor and an intolerance that really became legendary. It was under her reign that the infamous Spanish Inquisition from 1478 began, and this Inquisition continued on for several hundred years. Obviously, some points it was much more significant, much more flashy than at other points. But with all of this, it wasn't even just on the basis of looking to reform the church from some of these issues that it was dealing with, but it was also looking to deal with the idea of how is it that we interact with Jews and Muslims who are still living in the Spanish territories. This was something quite unique in Western Europe. Western Europe wasn't dealing with the Moorish invasions anymore, but there were still leftovers of both tradition and of culture and of people groups and of ethnicities living inside what will become a unified Spain. And so when you're looking to reform the church and you're looking for reasons to blame other people, or you're looking for reasons why everything's not going well, you really are going to find focuses on those of similar faith but quite distinct. And so the expulsion of Jews and Muslims, the persecution of those who desired to stay behind, even mass conversions. A lot of this doesn't really go over well, but it's part of the Reformation, and it's part of how some of these reformations really working top down do. I mean, we saw the similar thing in the English Reformations. Even if you're looking at somebody who's aiming for Protestant, or if you're looking at someone who's aiming for a Catholic Reformation in England, for instance, those top down ones usually become quite brutal. I mean, Mary wasn't called Bloody Mary for no other reason. I mean, the Protestants did the same thing when they came and took over as well. Probably not to the same level, but certainly did. It was just kind of one of the ways in which top-down, new, solid monarchies were dealing with things like this. Isabella of Spain did a lot of this alongside her archbishop, a man named Francisco Jimenez. Really interesting character, a very smart guy, very learned guy. He started off as a Franciscan friar. Didn't want the archbishopric, but this will kind of show you something about Queen Isabella. She appealed to the Pope to force him to become archbishop, which is kind of indicative of the kind of lady she was. And also why so much of the Spanish Reformation, the Catholic Spanish Reformation, was focused on monasticism and a call for monks to be obedient to their vows, especially those of celibacy, those of poverty. Things were getting out of hand there, just the same as they were everywhere. A lot of what was happening in Spain here under this Catholic Reformation was a lot of the printing of books to support scholasticism. The expansion of learning, the expansion of knowledge, even about the ancient world, led to one of the most fascinating books I would argue, in the late Middle Ages, early modern ages, and that is the Complutensian Polyglot. I'm going to spell that for you because I know if it was in person, somebody would ask me to do so. So that is the Complutensian. That's spelled COMPLUTENSIAN, and polyglot is exactly as it sounds, POLYGLOT. The Complutensian Polyglot sounds like you have no idea what this is. It's a multilingual version of the Bible, right? All in parallel: Hebrew, Greek, Latin, and Jimenez was a huge part of this, as was Isabella. This was finished. If you want some dates here, watch this. The Complutensian Polyglot, just to show you kind of the timeline of what we're dealing with, was finished in 1517. Now, for those of you who have been through this, I hope you know that date. I hope you know that year as the year that Luther was nailing his 95 Theses on the church door in Wittenberg. None of the significant Protestant reformations have even begun yet. And here we have a Catholic Reformation in Spain that's been going on for 20, 30 years. A very medieval version of a Reformation, but a Reformation nonetheless. Jimenez, just so you can see the level of effect from the humanistic side, Jimenez remarked that the Complutensian Polyglot, this multilingual version of the Bible, being able to connect Christians back to the original languages, he says that this edition of the scriptures, quote, opens the sacred sources of our religion, from which will flow a much purer theology than any derived from less direct sources. This edition of the scriptures opens the sacred sources of our religion, from which will flow a much purer theology than any derived from less direct sources. That is a really, really interesting statement. And when I say really interesting statement, I mean it is near Protestant and it is out of place if you are not familiar with how some of these Catholic reformations were attempting to be brought in. This is the idea that there is actually to connect back to the sources. Again, humanistic concept, this going back to the sources, the foundations of civilization, the foundations of our religion, to be able to connect with them directly, especially in terms of language or linguistics, whether in Hebrew and in Greek, is to actually overshoot past the Latin, past the even church tradition to a certain extent. Now, don't think that I'm saying Jimenez was, a Protestant by any stretch, not at all. But in this sense, when he's looking at the scriptures, when he's looking at the effect of going back to these sources, he sounds much more Protestant than you will find Catholics after this date. It's a really interesting way to speak about these things, and a remarkable book that I would encourage you to go read about. It's a fantastic attempt at familiarizing those learned Christians. But again, what are we missing? We're missing still vernacular translations. It's still Hebrew, Greek, and Latin. This is for study and scholastic. It's not for, for people to have on their nightstand table or anything like that. This Catholic Reformation of Spain, its Achilles heel, if you will, the great downfall of it was the way it dealt with dissenters. And for anyone who's aware of the Spanish Inquisitions, when theological reformations are forced by government or monarchical fiat, if you are working your theological reformation in lockstep with a powerful monarchy, the necessary and inflexible responses to doctrinal deviations is going to be significant. You're not going to be able to have a unified force of both monarchy and scholastic thinking, and then go out and try to reform the church. The second you meet any resistance, you're going to destroy them. I mean, that's just how it works. It happens multiple times throughout history, and both Protestant and Catholic alike, I would simply point out. And this one is no difference. And I would actually say it is one of the great tragedies of this Reformation. While it was attempted to be done with a goal towards connecting Catholicism to a purer form of its theology, it was counteracted by being so closely tied with a powerful monarchy. And as you well know, monarchies were kind of new in the world, and actually almost absolute monarchy is almost very new in Spain. And so there's a lot of growing pains with that are a little frustrated with it all. So that's one of the first of the Catholic Reformations, the one in Spain, one that's just an interesting thing to be aware of. If you're going through most church history overviews, at least in the Protestant world, you're not going to really talk about that much. But I at least wanted you to be introduced to it. Check it out. Look up both Francisco Jimenez, Cardinal Jimenez, the Complutensian Polyglot, and Queen Isabella of Castile. Just fascinating story. And especially since we're talking about all these things even before Luther, before Calvin, before Geneva, Zwingli, everyone. It's kind of a remarkable thing to see what was happening in scholasticism even before that, and in Spain. With that, let's move on to the next thing, right? I had mentioned that in Spain they were trying to deal with reforming monastic orders. This is perhaps one of the more interesting aspects of the Catholic Reformations, is that there consistently was this desire to fix monasticism. This had worked really well in the past 1,200 years. Whenever there was something going on, or whenever there was a lackadaisical attitude in how to carry out things, different orders of monks would show up, whether it was the Augustinian monks, or whether it was the Benedictine monks, or the Dominicans, or the Franciscans. You'll get different orders of monks that are trying to deal with the church in either new or unfamiliar or just horrible territory, wherever it finds itself in various levels of its own history. But orders like that have to be approved. You can't just go out and start a new monastery. It doesn't really work like that. It's not like today where, if somebody just gets in their mind, they can go start a church. It's not like that. You don't just, and if you are going to do that, you're going to end up as one of the anchoritics. You're going to be sitting on a pole in the middle of the desert by yourself, or you're going to be sitting in a cave by yourself while people drop bread down to you. You're not really going to get, established monasteries of Cenobitic monasticism without the approval of the church. And so the approval of the church for reforming these things is going to be absolutely necessary. And it's not just a reformation of monastic orders, and like Cardinal Jimenez in Spain would be calling for monks to hold your vows sincerely. It's going to go another step beyond that. There's going to be a whole new monastic order that is brought to bear on the Catholic Church in the 1500s, and that is the Society of Jesus, or as many people know them by their more shorthanded name, the Jesuits. The Jesuits was a monastic order, and is a monastic order, very unique one. It was founded by a man named Ignatius Loyola. Last name is spelled Loyola. Ignatius Loyola. Again, this is early mid 1500s. Ignatius Loyola was a soldier in his early adulthood. He broke his leg. I mean, that's actually an understatement. He shattered his leg in battle, and this becomes really problematic. You're not really at a place in medical history where shattering of legs is a good thing or an overly fixable thing, and so his future as a soldier is kind of put on, well, not even back burner. It's just put back on the shelf. He ends up turning to a life of prayer, and this becomes for him very unique, very I don't know the term to put to it. It's not just unique, it's far more meditative, right? It's not just liturgical, it's much more deep. Would probably be the way he would express it. Meditative, directed, intentional, mindful prayer. That's what I want to put it to. Mindful prayer. Things to meditate on, to consider. It's not just a repetition of things. It's something that involves the whole of being, right? And in the 1530s, if you kind of follow your timeline in your head, which is what I have to do when I teach these things, in the 1530s, and if you get 1530s in your mind, you're talking, Augsburg Confessions, Lutheranism is taken off, young John Calvin is about to come to Geneva for the first time, things like that are going on, right? In the 1530s, others start following after Ignatius Loyola's example, right? Devoted to prayer, devoted to a specific type of monastic order, a little bit more defined by just the same as some of the others, poverty and chastity. But the Jesuits have a whole nother flavor to them, and that is when they are actually officially brought in as a monastic order in 1540. It wasn't just poverty and chastity, but there was a unique relationship between the Jesuits and the papal office that hadn't existed with any other monastic order, and that is that not only was it vows of poverty and chastity, but there was a vow of obedience to the Pope. There was a very close relationship between the Jesuits and the papal office. If you're interested in learning a little bit more about Jesuit prayer and their interactions with these things, and how that largely affected Catholic prayer for the next 400 or 500 years, even down to today, Ignatius Loyola wrote a small book called Spiritual Exercises, and it was published in 1548. It's still in print today. That should just kind of show you how significant some of this is. Because of the age of exploration that was going on, again, 1500s. We're deep into the age of exploration. We're learning things about the New World. We're learning things about the Far East. The missionary endeavors of the Jesuits are almost second to none in the Catholic world. You get more of their involvement in the Far East, but so much of their involvement in Central and South America, with missionary movements, both for baptisms and conversions, and especially education, hospitals, things like this. Pretty unique stuff, really fascinating group. But that was part of the desire to fix the monastic orders, at least reform monasticism for the Catholic Church, from inside the Catholic Church again. Now, I don't want to put forward that there was no responses to the Protestant Reformation, because there was. I just wanted you to see that this was not the only thing going on. It wasn't just everything's problematic, and then Luther comes around, and then the Catholic Church waffles and wafts about. It's not like that. The Catholic Church was looking to respond to the Protestant reformers, but not on their terms. But the eventuality of official response comes to bear, right? So you not only have the Catholic Reformation of Spain, and then you have monastic order reformations, like the Jesuits, but then you have, even from the Protestant reformers themselves, you have demands for a council. Bring a council together so that we can address the concerns of those separating from the church. And if you remember, this is not really a great time to call for a council. The papal office has been growing in its strength. It's been growing in its political endeavors. It's been growing in a lot of its power. Not wanting to pull up conciliarism again is probably sitting high on the minds of many popes that were coming through. And so even the calls for councils to deal with these things that many of the Protestant reformers that were requesting, the resistance that Rome had towards pulling a new council lasted for almost 30 years. That becomes kind of problematic for them, right? And so you get from the very beginning people like Luther verbally calling out for a council to listen for these things and to address these things. But with the amount of the issues of authority that have been swirling around the Western Church, you're not really going to be getting popes that are too high on the idea of pulling together a council to address these things straight up. And you really won't even get a full solution to whether councils are higher than popes or popes higher than council in authority. You won't get that solved until the 1800s at Vatican I. But here back in the 1500s, it's still very tenuous. And so you're going to have a lot of resistance from Rome on this front to even pull together a council. But eventually, it certainly does pull together a council. Ken, I see a question from you here. What were some of the issues with the monastic orders which led calls to reform? Yeah, okay, so that was different in a lot of different places, but most of the issues were that they had a vow of chastity, but then they were known to have children and concubines and all sorts of things. Some of them were not only just monks, but they were also holding church offices, but in places that they weren't serving or living. And so there was a lot of nepotism going on. There was a lot of, purchasing church office. There was a lot of wealth when they had a vow of poverty. I mean, that becomes really problematic. So things like that are more of the issues that the monastic orders were. So for instance, Cardinal Jimenez specifically called out on monks to be faithful to the vows that they've taken, and poverty and chastity were the two big ones that people were going back on. Monks were just not treating them significant in any way. Hope that answers the question. If you have any further on that, post up some question on that. Okay, let's go into this. So Rome had resistance to any council. And it takes time for a council to come together anyway. And so it's not like you can just, ring a bell and everyone comes for a council. That takes time to put together, and, well, this is going to be a big one. And so it's called the Council of Trent. The Council of Trent is one of the most effective, broadly applicable councils in the history of the Western Church. Vatican I and Vatican II, both in the 1800s and the 1900s, come close. But the Council of Trent is one of the most overarching descriptions of what becomes modern Catholicism. So much so that I'm sure some of you have heard the term Tridentine Catholic, Tridentine Catholicism. In our day, it's kind of become synonymous with a traditional Catholic, or traditional Catholicism. Uses Latin, has a robust concept of itself and its history, and that's usually pitted against it's almost said in Catholic circles, a little bit dismissively, like you're a Vatican I Catholic or you're a Vatican II Catholic, which is kind of code for liberal. But a Tridentine Catholic is like a really traditional historical Catholic. Well, that's roots go straight back to the Council of Trent. Tridentine is just the Latin term for Trent. All of this comes back to this council. And the Council of Trent meeting, the classical dates for it are kind of worthless because it really meets in 3 phases, but I'll give them to you anyway. 1545 to 1563 is the Council of Trent. If you're good with numbers, you realize it's 18 years. So even when they do meet after about 25, 30 years of request, it still takes 18 years to work it all out. But there's a lot of reasons for that. They're working through a whole lot of issues. It's not like previous councils, right? I mean, when you held the Council of Nicaea, you were just addressing Arianism, right? Which is why the Nicene Creed is so hugely focused on who Jesus is, who the eternal Son is, eternally begotten, not made, all that language. That's all just dealing with Arian controversies, right? It's addressing a singular area of theology or a couple areas of theology that are related to each other. The Council of Trent has to deal with an overwhelming amount of issues due to the depth of challenge by the Protestant Reformations and the Radical Reformations and the Catholic Reformations inside its own ranks. And so its reach is broad and it is applicable and it is all over the place. And it's important for Protestants to realize how significant the Council of Trent is in making modern Catholicism. Without it, you don't have what you know of as modern Catholicism. It really is the linchpin that makes it what you and I have come to know, and what Catholicism even says of its own self. Because of its broad reach, the Council of Trent really remade or reformed, I would argue, the medieval Catholic Church into the modern Catholic Church that many of us would come to know. It doesn't stop there. It doesn't stop its development to that point. There were added developments and additional dogmas regarding Mary and papal infallibility and things like that are going to change it completely again in Vatican I in the 19th century, the 1800s. But for now, let's just stick with the Council of Trent. And I want you to see this rather than just knowing that a council happened and that there was an official answer to the Protestant Reformations. I do want to take you through the main points of it. I think it's important. And I know for those of you who are Protestant, the vast majority of people who watch this are Protestant. I want you to understand the Catholic answer to a lot of these things. And by the way, if I do have any Catholics who are watching this, who have found this after the fact, welcome. I appreciate you here. I hope you can understand, the amount of work it takes for someone who isn't religiously familiar with this to try to familiarize myself with this so that I can represent it well. That's my aim. So with that, okay. 1545 to 1563, the Council of Trent. Let's start with phase 1. Phase 1 is just for the first 3 years. That's 1545 to 1547. The main focus of the first phase of the Council of Trent is doctrinal issues. Main thing on the issue main thing on the table is the role of tradition, the role of the scriptures, the role of justification by faith alone. Justification through faith alone. This is what the Protestant reformers were saying up and down, not only Luther, but so was Calvin, so was Melanchthon, so were all of these other responses to the classic medieval salvific concept of the Catholic mind. And so the responses in the Council of Trent become the first official statement regarding salvation in the Western Church in all of history. There was a lot of just understood, or there was just a lot of here's what the church fathers say, but never has a council actually come down and made full-on declarations about salvation itself. And so the Council of Trent is the first time where official statements about salvation to this degree are ever made. And that's kind of normal too. Such statements really don't usually arise until there's a challenge to them. And so from the Protestant perspective, challenge had been made because there had been so much drift regarding the definition of justification in the Western Church. From the Catholic perspective, we didn't have any need to address these questions until these reformers came up and made it too simplistic and turned justification into a statement rather than an inevitable goal, right? And so, for those of you who are Protestant in my audience, I want you to be reminded again of kind of the Catholic concept of salvation is not the same that you and I would use when we describe salvation. In the Protestant world, we're pretty familiar with what we talk about with salvation, trust in Jesus for salvation, all these types of things, right? In the medieval concept, in the Western world of salvation, doesn't start with you having kind of a come to Jesus moment. In the medieval concept of salvation, it starts at your birth and your baptism, leading to baptismal regeneration and you entering a state of grace. This is the most important concept for, I think, Protestants to grasp Catholic theology at this time. Is your goal is not trying to get to this place where God says, okay, everything's fine. It's to maintain and to return back to a state of grace over and over and over again, right? So, well, you can only be baptized once, right, in this theology. And so after you're baptized as an infant, you enter the state of grace. Well, after this, you sin, right? Nobody should be presumptuous enough to say that they've gotten past sin, so they don't. And so when you sin, you have need to confess it. You must confess it to a priest, and then he will express to you certain penance that you can do. This is where I think a lot of Protestants, and I have heard very famous Protestant Bible teachers misteach this idea. Indulgences are not purchasing salvation. They are purchasing penance. And that's only when they're up for sale. It's a form of penance that the church does on your behalf. And so you can give alms in lieu of going out and doing a good work or something like this. Indulgences were meant to aid in penance. They weren't there to purchase salvation, at least not in the normal sense. That's a much more, I think, Protestant misunderstanding of even what Catholics say about themselves, even at the time. And so after this confession of your sin, your penance is done to return to a state of grace, right? And this cycle continues, and it's a treadmill. And I will say, from a Protestant perspective, I don't agree with this at all, but this is medieval Catholic. Even salvation is kind of a hard terminology to stick to this, but this is the life of a Christian. State of grace, sin, confession to a priest, penance, hoping to come back to a state of grace. But each time, this was one of the issues that Luther had. What if I missed a sin, right? And I didn't confess that, or I wasn't completely repentant or completely faithful or something along these lines. And this cycle, and almost like a downward spiral, and my return to a state of grace is never as pure as when I was first baptized. Well, this is where the role of purgatory comes in. Even for the faithful, the idea of purgatory is to purge from you all that stuff that's accumulated throughout your life, these venial sins that have made your state of grace a little bit less lustrous than it was at the beginning, right? And so purgatory will purge this from you and prepare you for heaven. That's kind of the concept. Your good works and penance, your works, your faith working through love, all of this is part of this cloud of returning to a state of grace and really important word, collaborating with the grace of God in order to bring about justification as a future reality rather than a present reality on your behalf, right? Nobody is really saying that they can earn their salvation. Again, that's an unlearned thing to say about even Catholic theology. Nobody's saying they can earn their salvation. The Catholic teaching on a lot of these things at this time was that only works of love are a part of their justification. That you are saved by faith in Christ. Of course, this is how the grace of God comes to us, along with many other means of grace. But but it's also with the works that inevitably are a part of that actually not just aids your justification, but collaborates with faith to bring about justification. And they will reject here in the Council of Trent, full stop, those who say that we are justified by faith alone, and pronounce anathema, which is curse, on those of us who teach that. So that becomes problematic. For me as a Protestant, obviously, I teach this. I don't think you can come to Scripture straight up without teaching that. It just kind of says it straight out. So that becomes problematic for us because this is still official Catholic teaching, and you can't pick and choose that. I still sit under the condemnation of the Catholic Church for teaching these things. So, that's just where it sits. The other thing that they were discussing at this first phase is really the big one, was the use of the Latin Vulgate as an official text of the Catholic Church. It really hadn't been, right? For all intents and purposes, the Latin Vulgate done by Jerome around the year 400 had been the unofficial, official Bible translation, Bible, not even translation, just that was the Bible of the medieval Catholic Church, and it had been so for 1100 and some odd years. But here it's actually, proclaimed that it's the only official text for things like theological disputes, councils. It was basically backing up some of the claims that were already coming at it, not only from the Protestant reformers, but also from their own ranks. People like Jimenez, who were, publishing things like, the Complutensian Polyglot, and going, hey, we can actually be aided by the Hebrew and the Greek, so that we know what Jerome was working from, because he translated from Hebrew for the Old Testament, Greek for the New. And so maybe we can be, improved upon to go back to the sources. Well, here, it's rejected. There can be vernacular translations, and even the Catholic Church has their own vernacular, like English translation and things like this. But as far as for official theological disputes and stuff, it's going to be from the Latin. Don't bring in your Greek, don't bring your vernacular translations to councils and to theological disputations. It's going to have to be done in Latin. Now, I will say, I argue that this is actually based in good intention. I do believe so. I believe that there was a large swath of this trying to protect against confusion, because to be perfectly honest, it's really, really hard, even in English, when we come together and we have multiple translations in our own language present in the same church service. That leads to confusion sometimes. It just does. Now imagine you have multiple languages present, and there's one language that everybody who's learned in these things knows, that's Latin, and then on the other side there's a bunch of people that have their vernacular translations, whether in English or whether in Dutch or whether in German or whether in Spanish or French, and they're trying to come in and address all of these things using all of those. It really becomes difficult. And so for that, the Latin Vulgate, together with the Apocrypha, and this was another thing, the Protestant reformers were saying, look, the apocryphal books, these books between the Old and New Testament are not scripture. They're helpful, they're interesting, they're good history, but they're not scripture. And no council had ever declared them as such. Nobody had ever seen them as such. They were always kind of had second fiddle playing anyway, in most of the Western Church. And the Council of Trent came back and, poo-pooed that idea entirely as well. That's my official teaching on what they did. And so they would accept all of the books of the apocryphal books, as we've come to call them now. That had an effect even in the Anglican Church, for instance. For those of you who really like the King James Version, the original King James Version had the full Apocrypha with it, because of stuff like this. So, that goes to a different question as well. So it wasn't just that they were dealing with salvation issues. It wasn't just that they were dealing with authority issues in scriptures. But if you're going to be dealing with the scriptural issues, you're going to be dealing with the big questions. What is the role of tradition, capital T, in theology, right? Now, that may not sound like a huge issue to you or me as a Protestant, right? We like to pride ourselves on our lack of tradition, right? We even have entire swaths of the Protestant world that, says things with a straight face like no creed but the Bible, or you just need to love Jesus or something like this. But none of that makes any sense. As soon as you start asking what is the Bible, you have to start defining things. You ask who is Jesus, you have to start defining things. So those things don't stand up under their own weight. But Protestants like to pride themselves on a lack of tradition, but we all have traditions, and some of them are very deeply held. Even in some of our lower churches, celebrate parts of the liturgical calendar, things like Easter, things like Christmas, things like July 4th. The question is, what do you do with tradition in the Catholic Church, especially in Tridentine Catholicism? There's tradition, as we would look at it, lowercase t, and then there's tradition, capital T, authoritative tradition. The declaration of the Council of Trent is that tradition, the authority tradition, the tradition of the Catholic Church is parallel to that of Scripture. Now that's a huge claim. That is a huge claim. And one that doesn't sit well with a lot of Protestants as well, because it kind of becomes hard to define what tradition. I have all the church fathers. I have several dictionaries to look up what they all agreed with or disagreed with, and it's very hard to find anything that all of them agree with. They all have differences. So when you say, tradition has an authority is high and is parallel with that of Scripture, it's really difficult because there's a lot of disagreement. Do you just poll them? And this is the discussion that's been going on for 400 years still. How do you is it just a democracy of those church fathers that we have left? What tradition is it? The councils, the creeds, things like this, and that becomes a lot of fostering ground for Christians that are both in Protestant circles and those in Catholic circles to try to address these issues direct. It makes it a little difficult, right? Along with this are the declarations making official officially significant the writings of Thomas Aquinas, for instance. His theology became the unquestioned dominant source of a lot of Catholic theology and tradition. Again, capital T. And Protestants think that we don't have tradition, but things affect us more when we don't know what they are than when what we know them to be. We say all manner of things that are traditional Christian things, and we don't really know their sources or why we're saying them. Or why we hold the opinions we do. Like, for instance, what do we do with the creeds, right? What do we do with, like, the Nicene Creed? Well, if you go to one church, they'll quote it. If you go to another church, they've never heard of it. What do you do with the Apostles' Creed? Well, you go to one church, they quote it, and you go to another one, they go, I have no idea what you're talking about. And things like this become difficult. It becomes things for Protestants to address and answer. But as far as for the Catholic Reformation, one of the Catholic Reformations here in the Council of Trent, the idea of elevating tradition, I want to talk about it accurately. In the Catholic mindset, this is defining tradition on parallel with Scripture as an authority. And so if you notice one of the issues we're going to have here, this is not going to make the issues of authority inside the Catholic Church any easier to figure out. See, now we not only have the Pope who interprets Scripture, and the Scriptures have an authority of their own, but then that's given to them by the Church in Catholic theology. But then the Church has its tradition, capital T, which is now parallel with Scripture, and it's also up to the Pope and the councils and everyone else to determine what tradition actually is. And so now you're dealing with trying to fix the authority issue by adding a little bit more official statement to other areas of authority claims, such as tradition and Scripture, and even bring in the Apocrypha now. So it's kind of like, if we add more authority figures, we're going to fix some of these authority issues. But in reality, it doesn't really do that. And a lot we're kind of talking about that. So that's phase one Thankfully, the next phases are smaller and have to do with some of the lesser things, but probably things a little bit more familiar to you, right? So that's phase one, right? Go to phase two. They take a break for 3 or 4 years and come back in 1551, 1552, that area, and take up the issues that were also being challenged, especially by the Lutherans. And so phase two is kind of the answer to the Lutherans. And one of the main focuses of this phase was on the issue of transubstantiation. Now, I have taught on transubstantiation before in medieval theology. Transubstantiation, for those of you who weren't with us for that, is the idea, the theologically held belief that the bread and wine at the Eucharist, at Mass, changes its substance. That's what's transubstantiation, trans-substance. It changes its substance into the body and blood of Christ, where it doesn't mean that it becomes a hunk of flesh and actual blood. It would still chemically be bread. It would chemically be, wine. But it's that its essence is now that of Christ. And this is part of the concept of the Mass as a sacrifice. So his body and his blood are truly not just present, but the substance of them is now the body and blood of Christ, right? One of the questions for the Council of Trent is, must a Christian hold to transubstantiation? Must they hold to this? And that becomes kind of issuous for some people, because especially with the rise of humanism, that becomes really hard, because when you're saying this is the body and the blood of Christ, but then you're looking at it and you're just going, it's bread and it's wine. It still is. It's identical than it was before it was on the altar stone or on the altar wood. Regardless of the relics that are buried within the altar, they didn't do anything to it, did they? Well, and the Lutheran answer to that was no, they didn't change its substance, but Christ is truly present in those elements. Lutherans held to a higher concept of this than most Protestants will today. Protestants hold it as kind of what Zwingli was saying. It's just more of a memorial meal, right? Do this in remembrance of me. But for the Catholic world, transubstantiation is absolutely essential to a lot of their theology. And so you're not going to be able to get anything out of this. You're not going to be getting any leeway on transubstantiation. By the way, the answer to give away the end, yes, a Christian must hold to transubstantiation. Mass is a sacrifice where Christ is represented over and over and over again. And Mass was then furthermore declared to be a true sacrifice that can even be offered not just for those in attendance, but even for the benefit of a deceased person. And so there's then we start having the development of requiem masses and things like that we're deal with a little bit later on in history. For some of these issues that have come up before, for instance, we had where people that were in the laity, they have certain aspects of the Mass's meal, the bread and the cup, held from them. They were just given part of the cup. They weren't given the bread, for instance. And at the Council of Trent, they did officially declare that it was not necessary for the laity to receive both the bread and the cup in order to receive the benefits of the Eucharist. Now, this was done as a trying to approach people and trying to make nice on some of these things. Sometimes is difficult in both these instances, but for a lot of Protestants, that really becomes problematic because it kind of drives a wedge between the laity and the clergy that they're trying to say, that really does interrupt the priesthood of every believer, which is something that a lot of Protestants were pushing at this time, and the Catholic Church really wasn't having anything of that. It's more important that the priest partake in both the bread and the cup, not so much the laity. The laity can just take one or the other. So the dealing with the Lutherans was really the massive part of phase two. Again, that's the shortest of them. That's just 1551 to 1552, and Yeah. So let's go to phase 3. Phase 3 is an interesting one, right? Phase 3 really deals with, and by the time we come to this, phase 3 is 1562 to 1563. Phase 3 happens where, now you got to realize this is nearly 20 years after this thing began. By the time we come to the 1560s, I mean, you've got the final versions of the, of Calvin's Institutes of the Christian Religion are out. I mean, you've got you got the longer catechism. You've got Puritanism is really starting to go massively in England. I mean, you've got full on developed, written, huge treaties on Protestant doctrine that are out there. By the time we come to 1562 for the final phase of the Council of Trent, Catholicism as a whole is realizing that the difference between Protestants, Lutherans, and the Catholic Church will never be bridged. And so what may have started as attempting to approach this on the same level, hey, let's agree, let's talk about this, let's talk about that, let's try to address this part, that part. At this point, there is no, there's no coming to agreement on these things. Everyone's starting to realize that and settle into the reality that the Western Church is going to become as much, if not more so, fragmented than the Eastern Church. And so you'll get much more, how do I say this, Catholic-y things coming out of the third phase. And that would be things like purgatory, which is finally and fully reaffirmed here. The existence of purgatory is absolutely necessary to Catholic theology, with at least their definition of venial sins and temporal consequences and imperfect states of grace in this life after sins. And so purgatory is reaffirmed here, and that's not an optional thing, by the way. And there's a lot of moral church reforms. A declaration on relics, and they put a lot of correctives and controls in place for relics. That's really important to notate, because a lot of people think that the Catholic Church was, all on about the misuse and abuses of relics, but there was a lot of correctives and controls and checks put in place to combat false relics. If any of you watched the Luther movie with me earlier this year, you'll remember the joke that I think it was Martin Luther was making, that there's enough nails of the Holy Cross to shoe every horse in Saxony. And there was, 13, I think it was, he was saying that 13 of the Holy Apostles were, 13 out of 12 Holy Apostles are buried in Spain, for instance, things like that. So issues about relics had been problematic for years, ever since the Crusades started bringing these things back. People had been having issues with false ones, with multiple ones, and so those types of things were truly being dealt with inside the Catholic Church. They knew there was issues with them, along with indulgences as well. Indulgences and the sale of them in the way that they had been done before had been put to an end by the Council of Trent. No longer was it just going to be this, going out on a trailer and hawking them, from city to city, like John Tetzel was doing. Even he was, I'll simply also bring up, even he was put in prison for this, and on house arrest and challenged to look into some of his dealings with all this kind of stuff. So that's right. That's important to know. Not only with that, the 7 sacraments of the Catholic Church were finally and thoroughly defined and authoritatively defined here at the Council of Trent. The 7 sacraments of the Catholic Church, if you're not aware, are those of baptism. Obviously, that starts off that whole cycle of entering the state of grace. That's baptismal regeneration. So that's the first, baptism. Confirmation, which is where you take these promises made at your baptism on for yourself. Eucharist, which is obviously we've been talking about, transubstantiation, things like this, right? Penance, which is how you return back to a state of grace or as close as you can be. Anointing of the sick, for instance, as well, is number 5. Marriage is another sacrament in the Catholic Church, and also holy orders, which is if you're going to become, Franciscan, Dominican, Augustinian, Benedictine, or as now Society of Jesus, Jesuit, or you're taking on a role of a bishop or a cardinal or something like this, right? So these 7 sacraments are thoroughly defined and laid out here. Again, as I'm consistently reminding, this is not the first time somebody's talking about 7 sacraments. That kind of theory had been around. It had been written on significantly in the 11 and 1200s, but there hadn't been a church council that just comes down and goes, oh yeah, by the way, there's 7. Even up to this date, there had been people theorizing that maybe there was 11, maybe there was 12, maybe there was 13, something like this, but defining it out of the gate now, and you can see how influential the Council of Trent is today. There's still 7 sacraments for the Catholic Church. That's not changing anytime soon, most likely. There's also moral church reforms made in the rulership of these churches. Rules for bishops, for instance. They were to reside and remain in their districts. There's a condemnation of pluralism, this idea that you can have multiple bishoprics, and I mean, why not if you didn't have to live in them? And so there was a kind of an overhaul in everything, kind of cleaning house, if you will. What you're going to realize, though, is that people now have choices. That's never existed before. Before, if the Catholic Church was doing something and it was problematic to you, there wasn't alternatives. Now there are. If you live, well, I mean, it's a little bit different if you live in a place that is Protestant, because now you'll have Protestant states and you'll have Protestant city-states like, Geneva or Bern or something like that. But now you can actually move around, or you can actually have different churches nearby, or in the city over. One is Catholic and the other one is Protestant, and so you're going to get a little bit more flow around. You're going to get a little bit more politics are a part of this side, and you'll have this king going against this king, and Protestant v Catholic, and the lines are just being drawn. That's not going to bode well for the 1600s, by the way, just to kind of give that away on the front end. The 30 Years' War is looming here by the time we get not even a quarter of the way through the next century, where you have Europe going to war with itself between Protestants and Catholics, or Protestant countries versus Catholic countries. And some of that just gets really brutalized. And it gives rise to modernism in a really unique way. And so we'll get to all of that when we get there. But here, this desire to fix the Catholic Church from inside really shows up in their treatment of their bishops. You need to be committed to where you are. You can't be a bishop of a place that you don't live in, never have visited, and don't ever frequent. I mean, we're talking about them being a bishop in one city and they haven't been there in 4 or 5 years or 6 years. They don't even live there. They don't know anybody there. They don't know the people that they're supposed to be guiding. They don't know the local priests. They know nothing. That becomes really problematic. If you're supposedly a bishop, but you only just hold that position and you've never met anybody from those churches, that kind of becomes problematic for people. Beyond that, there's an increased push for education. Again, this kind of comes with the idea of monastic reform really flooding into the idea of monastic reform. Excuse me. Sorry, I was just reading a question here. Can you ask the question? So last rites is not a sacrament. Oh, that's what I mean by anointing of the sick. For those who are, heading towards death or whatnot, that'd be along those lines. Just stated in a different way, as far as I'm aware, anyway. Yes, good question. increased push for education for bishops really is more of a monastic push. Again, you'll have some that will hold monastic role and some that will hold bishop role. But the idea is that in this world now, in the late 1500s, you really can't have unlearned bishops anymore. Now people are starting to get into, they're starting to get into a world that has educated people all over the place. And we can't really get away with, not that people are trying to get away with this, it will not do to have bishops that have no education anymore, because people that aren't trained in theology, people that aren't trained in, what these things are, really make a mess of things in every place. And so that's one of the moral reforms that the third phase of the Council of Trent brings in, trying to fix some of those issues. Yeah. One last little thing here. I mean, that's the last I have on the Council of Trent here for tonight. That's a lot of ground to cover. I know that's probably much more detailed than you signed up for. I hope it's helpful, because it really helps to clarify how these things come down to us, and what responses there were, and what interactions there were. And so, as far as the Council of Trent is concerned, that is the official answer to the Catholic Reformation. It's a little bit difficult to teach on something that declares me deserving of hell for believing the things that it refuses, but that's okay. It's kind of one of those things that you look back and you try to understand how it is that Catholicism got to that point. I hope those of you who have been along this path with me, I think we're 43, 44 episodes in, can at least appreciate why we got to this place, even in the Western Church. Why, by the way, the Eastern Church does not hold to these things. They're not going to hold to anything like purgatory or the seven sacraments, or even relics on the same level, at least is connected to things like penance, like you will in the Western Church, even transubstantiation and things like this. So, yeah. So, just a word of also of response here towards the end here is, not only do we have council, Jesuits, and you have other reformations happening in local places, but after the Council of Trent, you're going to have more or less official responses to the Protestant world, and this is in the form of Catholic apologetics. And so this is a really interesting place to go to, because it almost goes to the place of where the Protestant world is interacted with on the basis of estranged brothers, in at least in the best case scenario. In the worst case scenario, we're all heretics, but in the best case scenario, we're estranged brothers, and maybe we can reason with you. And so you'll get Catholic apologetics throughout history that seek to defeat Protestant arguments. For instance, one of the most significant early versions of this, and I would actually say the most significant of the past 500 years, nobody's really actually quite come close as far as reach, is a book written by a man named Robert Bellarmine. Bellarmine is spelled Bellarmine. Robert Bellarmine wrote the book on the controversies of the Christian faith. He wrote that in 1593. And if you just want to look this up, you can go get a little English translation of this on PDF form almost anywhere online. Just search for On the Controversies of the Christian Faith by Robert Bellarmine, and pull up an English translation of this and just read some of this, because this becomes the most influential Catholic apologetic work against Protestants even to today. You'll have really no change in some of the challenges that are brought about, such as authority issues and the definition of the faith and who has the right to do this, and the creeds and all sorts of stuff like this. So worth a read, worth going and checking out. If you like homework and you like filling your mind with stuff like that, you're welcome to do so. It's fascinating. It's not a simple read, but it's an interesting one. And that would be interesting to see, because some of the approaches to Protestantism in the years after this were a little bit different. So Robert Bellarmine on the Controversies of the Christian Faith from 1593. So, guys, that's all I have. I'm grateful again that you're able to make it through all this with me. It's a lot of ground to cover, but it's one of those things that I think is really, really helpful to spell out and to work out with everyone. So, and for any of you who may be Catholic and following along with me, if I did offend in any way, I hope you can hear the tone of my voice. I have no intention of doing so. I really do want to represent people and their beliefs accurately, so that people can understand what both sides are. So, Lord's blessings to you all. My thanks to you all as well. I wish you all the best.